All right, let's kick things off with a little bit of a discussion about depth and width processing, and of course, levels and panning. Now, we did go over a bit of this last week, so part of this is a review, and then also a matter of bringing it up to the next level before we actually get into the mixing itself. So, if we go back over here to the drawing board, you'll remember that there are a few things that happen when we switch between headphones and monitors. So, one of the things that we discussed was how, in our panning scheme, how things and our levels appear in headphones straight across, or almost a straight line through our head, with a little bit of vertical and a little bit of depth, but mostly it's in this straight line between our head. Whereas when we're listening through monitors, we get the sound field out in front of us, and so there is this little bit of a separation, the space between what we're listening to and ourselves. So it's not appearing inside our head, it appears slightly out in front of us. The other thing that we discussed was what happens when we pan things across the sound field. And if you recall, when we move something across from left to right or right to left, what will happen is the sound will start to get a little fuzzier as we go towards the middle when we're listening in monitors. And that has to do with the fact that the right speaker will feed both ears with a delay, left speaker will feed both ears with a delay, and the combination, we're essentially getting four signals that the brain is processing, right? Because there's the two delayed signals and the two direct signals. And so in order for something appear center, it's what we call a phantom image center. So we'll get the appearance that the sound source is here because it's coming equally from both speakers, but that creates another problem, which is a comb filtering effect. Those delayed signals add in almost the same information, not exactly, whatever, a little less high frequency because it has to diffract around your head. There's less focus, less level, and also delayed. And when that's added in, we'll tend to get somewhat of a filtered, fuzzier, not as focused type of sound. So even just panning a guitar, for example, hard left or hard right, it will come through more clearly in monitors, right? Because we're getting it from a single sound source. It hits both ears with the timing, and so our brain calculates what that is for localization and positioning, and the comb filtering effects are greatly minimized. When we double it up, then it starts to be a problem. So we have this progressive thing where as we get towards the center, the signal gets a little less fuzzy. Usually it thins out a bit in the mids and low mids and low end as you go towards the center. And this actually means that the way that we process the signal has to kind of work for both realms when we're going back and forth between headphones and monitors. So one of the other things that is important to understand as we start to work with sounds and moving them around and we go back and forth between the differentials and the sound field is that there are two primary principles that I want to discuss. One is that lower frequency sounds like basses will have a tendency to occupy a wider spectrum of energy. So often you see me draw dots or lines, or circles and things like that. And lower frequency instruments will sort of occupy a larger spectrum of space. And this is true in headphones as well in monitors. So there's something here that equally comes across. And the effect of this is really sometimes felt more, especially with closed back headphones, or with sometimes with open back headphones, because of the freedom of movement of the driver that allows that extended low end to come through more clearly. And it can sometimes be overwhelming and keep us from properly judging the low end of a mix. So it's important, as I had going back now a couple of weeks in classes rather, and discussing the topic of finding that balance of clarity in your headphones. And if that means that you're using software equalization with SonarWorks or whatever to balance out the frequency response so that comes through more clearly, great. Or if it means upgrading your headphones to something that's at a higher level, so that clarity and separation of the low end or detail of the low end comes through more clearly. Fantastic. However you end up getting there, it's important to understand that that exists. It's a natural problem. It has a lot to do with the fact that our brain can't localize the information, and so it just becomes a little more pillowy and more naturally bigger because we can't localize it. As we go up the frequency spectrum, so if we were just saying, let's just, almost forget what we have here for a second. So let me delete this here for a second. If we were looking at the frequency spectrum where, on one hand we have, 20 hertz, right? So let's just say this is the lower range and we have 20K up here on the top is the high frequency range. There's somewhat of a pyramid effect that occurs with the frequencies in terms of our localization of them. In other words, if we have a sound that's predominantly low frequency energy like a bass, and so the majority of the energy is going to exist down in this lower area, it's going to occupy a wider spectrum of space. But as we go up towards the top and we say, let's say we cut through that 2 to 6K range, that same sound will occupy a narrower field. And I think even this is perhaps a little bit, it's probably more of a curve like this than anything in terms of the balance of the frequency. So things will widen out as we get lower and harder to localize, and they will get narrower and become more pointed. In some ways, what happens up here is that the frequencies kind of become so high that even just like a simple movement of the head, if you're listening through speakers, can make certain frequency zones disappear. And there's a lot of reasons for this. That's going to be with the acoustics of the space. If you're sitting exactly between your speakers, like if you stand up out of your chair listening to the speakers and notice that all the high frequencies go away, and you move your chair up and down, you can really notice it different because most speakers or monitors have very directional high frequency drivers. They're meant to sit in that sweet spot, that zone, exclusively in order to make the whole thing work. But you will still have a lot. You'll have like as you go up higher, there are very few things, almost nothing that has natural fundamental frequency energy up that high. It's usually ambient energy that's added on top, or it's harmonic layers going up an instrument, things like cymbals and stuff like that have this really dense set of harmonics up in that high frequency zone that gives that air. And it actually tends to be, when it's like that, fuzzy and less localized. So the primary thing to remember here is that the lower frequencies will occupy a wider spectrum of space. So that's kind of the general point here. So what does that mean? It means that when I draw things up here and I say a bass or a kick drum, and let's just say that we want to place it here, it's actually occupying, like a wider area over here. Whereas if I talk about a vocal and I put a vocal out front, the vocal is going to occupy a tighter field because it has its dominant energy is in a zone where we can localize frequencies very well. And that's been, developed for thousands and thousands of years as a survival mechanism. We most recognize the human voice, right? So all of those different things are important because when we set levels and panning, what we're dealing with is not just the balance of energy of of an instrument overall to each other, but the balance of dominant frequency energy within those different elements of the mix. And so when we start to push in certain things, like for example, people have difficulty mixing basses, particularly with headphones and even with speakers. One, because it's difficult to monitor, right? So that, it's why I spend so much time on tuning and really understanding, particularly the low end, because it's one of the more difficult areas, or the area that most people have problems with. And you need to understand that. So when you're mixing in a bass, for example, into, say, the drums. So let's just say you got the balance of kick snare the way you like and cymbals, and you got the drums more or less laid out the way you want. You start mixing in the bass into it. When you're listening to that, what frequency zone are you listening to or focusing on as you bring that in? And if you focus on the low frequency energy, you'll often find that the bass ends up sounding low in level, where you can't hear the note, meaning that when you get to the equalization stage, you're going to be adding in presence frequencies so that you can actually hear the notes being played, right? And or if you mix the bass in, for example, and you mix it so that you can hear the note, which is a little bit, more mid-range energy that we localize a little better, and you mix it there, you're going to find that you have an excessive amount of low end, and now your equalization is going to be about taking away low frequencies to sort of balance that section. So one of the difficulties that people have in this regard when they start putting together a mix, headphones or speakers, whatever, is that with each element of the mix, there are going to be different roles that those elements play within the frequency spectrum, right? So, for example, you have a kick drum and a bass, and you have a big, rich sounding piano. You have three elements of the mix that occupy low and low mid frequency energy. So now the balance of those three within each other becomes an important element. What drives the warmth of the track? Is it the piano with the richness and the width, so you thin out the bass? Or is it the bass and the piano sits back and you thin it out a little bit more? And then that becomes a matter of subjectively listening and saying, well, what really carries the energy of the track? If it's primarily a piano vocal track, it would be piano right away, compromise the bass sound, or lessen the amount of energy in the bass sound that occupies that space. Get it to fill out what's missing from the piano, right? And sort of set it that way. As we work through these things in headphones, there's another thing that occurs as we switch between speakers and headphones. And of course, talking about the software modeling. So, and on one end here, let me just start here. Let's just say that I have a sound, and this is my sound right here, and let's just say that it's a vocal track. And I mix it to a certain location. Let's say it's right between the speakers right here, just for convenience. And if I mix it, perhaps it has like, maybe I create like a big sound with it. Like I mix it louder. One of two things that will happen when you mix something louder. One is it will get bigger, right? You get the feeling that it gets bigger, and it will also come forward in the speaker toward you, right? And so it will tend to dominate the mix, right, coming forward. However, when we mix with headphones, so if I take this away and switch over to here, if I take this away now and I mix it in headphones, the front back movement is very minimal, right? So the raising in volume occurs where we're making it bigger in the headphones, right? And if we lower the volume, it tends to get smaller. And in this case, it's showing you like, just the way that the graphics work here. It's sort of making this a little bit more dense, but in a way, when you make it lower in level, it becomes a little bit fuzzier, a little bit less clear. So in speakers, when we raise the volume, we get more clarity and focus, and it becomes bigger and moves toward us. When we raise the volume of something in headphones, it becomes bigger and more focused, okay? But it's not really moving in a front-back field. The front-back field differential, if we lowered the volume, would be that the vocal would tend to get less detailed and kind of start to fuzz out a little bit, or just get a little softer sounding. And so if you're setting balances in this way with headphones and you're not using the headphone software, one of the things that you have to primarily focus on is the detail of each element of the mix. Remember, it's not colored with the crossfeed and the comb filtering effect. What you have to focus on is you have to focus on the detail. And blending those elements in is not just the level thing. The level perception will be there. You'll get the change in level, but you also get the change in the detail of it. So the more you mix it back, the less detailed it will become. This happens exactly in speakers, right? When you mix something backward, it tends to become less detailed. And this is, when we get in past the equalization, which sort of finishes up the leveling of the mix, right? Because when we set our basic levels and pan positions, we're trying to primarily move things into a position that frames the arrangement or frames the song or sets the stage for, we're staging basically where the elements of the mix are going to appear, right? So we set our panning to kind of put them out in that left-right spectrum. We set the levels to sort of primarily set the starting front-back position, right, in the sound field when we're working in monitors. And that translates in headphones to more clarity or less clarity, right, along with the volume change. And it's important to really make that distinction and understand what that means. And when we get to the level and panning stage with this, when we start to do it and start to dive into this in more detail, I'm going to point this out and go back and forth between our monitor setup and the straight headphones so we get a sense. So I want to be able to go through set balances within, say, the drums and bass. Let's just say we start with that. And we set that up, and then I want to switch back and forth and say, well, what happens when I throw this into the monitors? What gets compromised? Point that out, right? Notice those changes, notice those differences, get used to them, and set a balance between the two where you get the best compromise of both. And then what you're achieving is something that will translate between the two. Okay, and this is always the kind of target with all the steps in the mix process, is getting something that will work in both. If you only optimize it for headphone experience, when you throw it onto speakers, a lot of the depth and sound field information will not translate and not get or will get lost. Remember that the fact that you don't have that comb filtering, that phantom center, although it is a phantom center, is more a focused phantom center. It doesn't, because there's no crossfeed, you end up with that same clarity as you go across the spectrum from left to right. You just get the width changes. Now, one other thing on the width changes before we kind of move on and get into some of the more detailed elements of this. When we work with headphones, what we're primarily dealing with in terms of the frequency spectrum is kind of a 180-degree type of thing, right? It actually, it does sort of run a linear path through the ears, but when we pan things across the spectrum, we have a much broader sense of the pan position, a more detailed sense of the pan position. Now, it's pretty simple, the reason why. If you think about it and you say, let's just say that 0 is the center here, we can go 100 left and 100 right. So we have a range of 200. We could hear the detail between the difference between, say, having a pan left of 60 versus a pan left of 70 in more detail in headphones than we can hear when we switch everything to monitors. Because now, right, our spectrum here is different. It's not 180 degrees, it's 120 degrees, right? Or this, 60-degree angle, right, that we're getting here. So instead of things coming in like hard left and hard right, where there's this sort of spectrum out, now that difference between 60 and 70 is, here to here, right? These smaller differences, right? It's just like, hey, we got this. And, that positioning, that move maybe a little bit this way, a little bit that way, maybe we can't quite hear the detail that as clearly as we can hear when we're working in headphones, where, let's see if I can just put that up here, where, we have, put this up here so it doesn't get blotted away. where that detail, and maybe this isn't the greatest example here, we'll be able to hear that more refined detail moving from here to here within it. And those are important things to understand in the way that that translates. And this is true when you set the width of your monitors. The wider you make the monitors, the more detail you hear in the pan, all those graduations of the pan that go across the spectrum. The closer you put the speakers together, the less that you hear that. And the more the center image strength starts to get higher. The 60-degree thing is important because it sets a compromise, a nice balance of the center image strength that's sort of mostly equal to what you have on the left or right. And when you make the speakers wider, the center image strength weakens, and you hear even more detail because that movement from left to right happens across a broader space, right? So you get that perception. It's a little bit tricky sometimes to kind of understand this clearly. The other thing is there's a very finite space between our from one headphone to the next. So for the simplicity of math, let's just say it's 1 foot, whatever that is, from one end, to the other, one speaker to the other. So, those graduations in some sense may be smaller because that actual physical distance between those 2 points is much smaller, but it's so much clearer because you don't have all of the crossfeed stuff that you hear the detail of it more as it moves across the spectrum. And I guess that's kind of part of the differential, whereas something is out in front of you and the separation of your actual physical monitors might be, let's just say it's 3 feet. All right, so now those steps would seem to be like, oh, they're covering a broader area, but because they're less focused and you start to bring in other aspects of the acoustics of the room, the detail often is not as clear. Okay, anyway, so hopefully that made sense. The way I didn't completely undo everything that I said. But when we approach the mix, we're going to talk about and get into the detail of these different aspects and how they play out when we translate between the monitors and the headphones. All right, so before we actually get into the level and panning stage, and getting into that, we're going to do a track analysis here. We're going to take a look at the individual tracks and have a listen to what they actually, what the functional role of each is. Start to strategize out the mix, right? Where we're going to place different elements of the mix, what their functional role is, and we'll break those down because that becomes an important part of sort of staging or framing the entirety of the mix so we understand, how all of this works, right? How it's all going to play out, or how it's going to lay out when we put it all together. The other thing that is important is getting into tuning your ears before you actually start the work. And that's really about, loading up the headphone playlist that I created, or if you have your own, that's great. And actually, before you start working, do a short tuning session. Listen, how are you hearing today? Notice how you're hearing low frequencies, mid frequencies, high frequencies. Some days I load up my monitor playlist and I listen. It's like, whoa, everything kind of sounds thin, right? Where's all the low end? And then I kind of settle in after about 5 or 10 minutes and it's like, okay, I kind of reset my balance there. And sometimes they come in and everything seems warm and dark. And it's like, okay, all right, well, let me kind of get myself calibrated. And in our brain, will actually calibrate itself, and we'll get into that in make sure that at least we have a good sense of how we're hearing today before you begin the work and kind of get yourself tuned in. This is something that every engineer that I ever worked with as an assistant, and what I always did anytime I first walked into a studio, was to put on some discs of things that I knew really well. I wouldn't spend a ton of time, but I would start listening. It's like, okay, how am I hearing today? What does this control room sound like today? Are there any issues with the monitoring? I want to make sure the speakers are set right. Because people move them around at different angles and different setups. I want to make sure everything is configured the way I want. And in your own setup, you don't have to do those things. You tune it in, you just go. But it's important to get yourself tuned in before you get too far into work and then realize, hey, wait a minute, everything sounds out of whack. When you take it outside the studio, we don't need that to happen. All right, so let's wrap it up here and let's move along right to the next lesson.